Good morning. Welcome to Miami-Dade College's Eduardo J. Padron Center. And we are here today to talk about identity politics in the 2020 presidential elections. This is an event that's being hosted by both Miami-Dade College Eduardo J. Padron campus and the Jaffer Institute for Interfaith Dialogue and Education. Now, with us, we have two panelists that are going to be talking to us today about the role that identity plays in the 2020 presidential elections and public policy in the United States. Today, Miami-Dade College's Padron campus's Social Sciences Department, in collaboration with the Jaffer Institute, is going to be hosting a panel discussion on the role of identity politics in the 2020 presidential elections and the role in public policy as well. So we're going to have Professor Miriam Abety, Dr. Abety, and Dr. Homayounvash, who is the director of the Jaffer Institute, along with myself as moderator, to basically discuss these issues of what is identity politics, what role does it play in political polarization and political socialization, how does it affect political psychology, the voters' attitudes, and how is it that public policy is formulated based on these issues?
The most important thing that we're doing here is informing our students about the election process, about identity, on identity politics, and how it influences the way that we as a country are polarizing ourselves every day more and more.
Today we were here to do a panel discussion with Dr. Richard Tapia and Dr. Abety on identity politics in U.S. presidential elections, and the role that party polarization and identity politics is playing in this electoral cycle.
The two panelists that we have here today, number one is going to be Dr. Homayounvash, which is a director of the Jaffer Institute for Interfaith Dialogue and Education. He's also a professor of political science here at Miami-Dade College, where he teaches comparative Middle Eastern and North African governments. He also teaches a course on Islam in America and Islam in the modern world. We also have with us Dr. Miriam Abety, professor of psychology with Miami-Dade College at the Padron campus. She teaches courses not just in psychology, abnormal psychology, but also in human services and intercultural communications and relations, multicultural communications and relations here at Miami-Dade College Padron campus. So today, when we're talking about identity, I like to open it up with a quote as we move into the panel discussion. And the quote is from Virginia Woolf in The Waves. "I am made and remade continually. Different people draw different words from me." So I want to draw different words from our panelists here on identity. And I'm going to open up with Dr. Abety and then come to Dr. Homayounvash on this question on social identity and identity politics. And the first question I have is, what is social identity theory and the difference between social identity and identity politics?
Okay, good morning, everybody. I think that the first thing that we have to look at is, what is identity? So identity is the concept that you have of yourself. It's how you describe yourself. So I could say I am a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a student, I'm a professor, I'm a friend, I'm a Democrat or a Republican or independent or the meditation party. I belong to a certain religious affiliation. So how I describe myself to you, the world, is my identity. And when you're looking at social identity, what we're doing is we want to belong to a group. So we look at socially, which groups do I belong to? Do I belong to a certain religion? Do I belong to a certain political party? Do I belong to a certain service organization? So how I relate myself to my group is very important. And then besides my group, which is the in-group, it's how I compare myself to my group. I belong because we share certain values or issues together. And then there's the out-group. The out-group is them. When you hear people in politics say, we are this and that, they are that, we're beginning to isolate or polarize ourselves from one group to another. And so when you're looking at identity politics, usually what's going on is that, for example, with the civil rights movement, with the women's liberation movement, with the LGBTQIAP movement, you're looking at different ways that we have felt threatened And so we need to find a way to come out on top by defending ourselves. And so with that comes a lot of polarization. And I think what you're seeing in our country and globally as well, before, if you were a Democrat, you could be a liberal Democrat, you could be moderate, you could be more conservative. And with the Republicans, the same with independents. Today, it's almost like the two polarizations. You're either to the extreme right or you're the extreme left. And so the more we polarize, the more difficult it becomes for us to understand each other. It's no longer about our political values. It's no longer about economy, but it's more about what group do you belong in.
Dr. Homayounvash?
Yeah, to me, your identity defines your sense of self. In a sense, it gives you authenticity, at least in your head. And that's why I think it's such a crucially important determinant of how you place yourself in this world and how you make sense of this world. And identity politics, I think, is crucial, and its nexus with democracy is so important. I think it's becoming increasingly more important. Because for me, identity politics, because of its exclusionary dynamics, where you define your sense of self based on a relatively parochial identity signifier. And the identity signifier could be your race, your gender, your language, where you live, your economic status, and so on and so forth. So it could be any number of things, your party affiliation, for example. And I think it's undermining of the democratic process because like Dr. Abety mentioned, it forecloses the domain for civic and civil dialogue, and it tends to incentivize you to view your political rivals as your enemies. So almost no opportunity is wasted to demonize your political rivals, and every single issue becomes an ideological issue and hence becomes subjected to politicization. And I guess a case in point today is how the coronavirus is being politicized and being viewed through an ideological prism in this country. So things that that used to be completely apolitical now are infused and saturated by ideology and politics. And like I said, I think in the long term, that is very corrosive of the institution of democracy. And over the long term, I think it's also corrosive and erosive of civil dialogue in a liberal context.
Thank you. You mentioned identity being part of a process, and it reminded me of Alexander Wendt's work when he came out with constructivism within international relations on how identity is constructed and interests are constructed based on how people within a society or groups within a society dialogue and interact with one another, which comes to build on how that identity begins to change. They define their interest and basically go after those interests. And you also mentioned the process within the political sphere, within political parties. And it really leads me to the next question on how identity politics has changed the traditional role of political parties. Has party polarization and conflict between political parties intensified the role of identity politics? You mentioned the role that identity politics had on creating some polarization. Now, the question I have is, how does that interaction works in reverse, where Alexander Wendt spoke about the cycle within identity and constructivism? Can you speak a little bit about how political parties influence identity as well?
For those of you guys who are not international relations majors, Alex Wendt is a towering figure in international relations theory, and he kind of mainstreamed this idea of constructivism in international relations, making the claim that that your identity is essentially what you make of it. And in that sense, from that perspective, your identity is not static. It's actually quite dynamic. It waxes, it wanes, and it changes, like Dr. Tapia mentioned. So, for example, during the election season, maybe your party affiliation is the most dominant determinant of your identity. After, a terrorist attack, your national identity becomes the most dominant factor. So remember that, depending on the context, you kind of tap into one of those identity signifiers to make sense of the world. And I think identity politics and party polarization, at least in the United States, has actually a long history. So if you look at at U.S. history since the beginning of the Republic, maybe except for the 4 years during the George Washington administration, I'm going way back, and maybe a few episodes, for example, during World War I, during World War II, and I would say a few years during the Cold War. Except for those, episodes, partisan politics has been the defining feature of American politics. But I think what's happened over time is that the partisan divide in this country is not simply ideological anymore. I tend to think that there are 3 deep divides in the United States. There is a race divide, I would argue. There is a religion divide, and there is also a geography divide. So, for example, those that affiliate themselves with the Republican Party, our contemporary era, tend to be, I would argue, more, in terms of their racial identity, more white. In terms of their religious identity, more religion-leaning. And in terms of their geography, they're more suburban/rural. On the other side, those that identify with themselves with the Democratic Party, I would argue they belong to minority groups in terms of their race. They're more secular in terms of their religious disposition, and they're more urbanites in terms of their geography of living. And I think it's because those 3 fault lines are now working in tandem. Our partisan politics seems so much more polarized than it traditionally used to be, and sometimes it feels like the divide between the political parties is simply unbridgeable.
I just wanted to add to that, from a psychological perspective, what you're really looking at is what James Watson used a long time ago for marketing purposes, is the quality of fear. And what's going on is, if I feel afraid, whether I'm a majority or a minority in this country, which right now in politics, if you're white, what is the fear that's going on? We're being replaced by minorities. We have to do the best to keep our own. They're becoming more nationalist instead of globalist, as we used to be way back when. With the onslaught of globalization, now you're seeing, globally, that people are becoming more nationalist. They're closing more doors, even with the coronavirus. And, it's the thing that's trending now. But if somebody would have told me a month ago that 3 women would be fighting over rolls of toilet paper, I would never have believed it. Yet you see on air, they're showing it, people fighting to get toilet paper because they're so afraid that we're all going to be quarantined. And so what happens when you're looking at our identity and politics, you're looking at, how do I feel threatened, and how do I make you all believe that you are a threatened class? And so therefore you have to stick to us. Whether you think we're saying truth or not, it doesn't matter. We belong to the in-group. We have to defend ourselves, and we have to fight against them. So fear is an extremely motivating factor, especially in politics today.
I wanted to follow up on that question, because you opened up, Dr. Abety, you opened up saying how one identifies, and you've spoken about the psychological aspects of fear moving a person towards one identity over another. Now, when political parties aim to politicize certain issues to try to shape an identity, besides fear, what other psychological, political psychology can be used by the political parties to begin to influence identity politics?
Well, I think that one of the most important things besides fear is making you feel like you belong and be part of this group. And, they say the bigger the lie, the more people are going to believe it. So if you start spinning things, you start saying, this is what we believe in, this is the truth, and this is what we believe in, this is the truth. You say it often enough, and, my poor mom, I remember that she, I'd come home from work and she would tell me the last news about something that really didn't make too much sense. And I'd say, Ma, where'd you get that information from? Oh, I got it from the radio, so it must be true. And so the thing is that the more you believe it's true and the less we critically examine things, because, the whole thing today is everything is fake news. And so now how do you as students decipher fake news from real news? Do you just listen to, your tweets or Twitters and the social media, or do you actually do your homework? Do you really try to find out when somebody says something, what did they say before, what was going after? Because psychologically, the people that are great spin masters are the ones that know what's going to get you emotionally. They're not thinking about your intellectual brain. They're now looking at your primitive brain or your emotional brain, right? So what they're trying to do is get that started and activated. And so all I have to do is post a few posts about whatever your other group, your out group is. They're trying to do this to you. So now I'm trying to make you angry enough to do something, because fear and anger are the best motivators for anything to happen.
It's interesting you mentioned that. George Schwartz, that was a media expert on political campaigns, he says you need 4 responsive chords. Hope, love, anger, and fear are the 4 chords. And you touched on 2 of the 4 of George Schwartz's, but they are powerful forces within political campaigns and the media. And my next question leads into the media. What role does the corporate cable news media play in intensifying identity politics? And to follow up on that, what is the impact that has on democratic institutions? So we'll start with Dr. Homayounvash.
Thank you. I think the selling card of the cable news media in this country is outrage. And it could be real, it could be manufactured, it could be inflated. So you have an atmosphere where our partisan press and partisan media, unfortunately, depicts the other side as inept, even sometimes as stupid, as dangerous, and they the mechanism they use for creating this dynamic is through name calling, misrepresentation, belittling, and a host of other comparable mechanisms. And like I said, I think that's very corrosive of our political process and our democratic values, because you have to remember that it's much easier, like Dr. Abety mentioned, to appeal to people's sense of vulnerability and emotionality than it is to their higher sense of intellect and rationality and their interests. And I think the media, most of which, cable media, most of which has unfortunately become, partisan press, appeals to that. I mean, in this country, you might think that, we live in a high-choice media system. Yes, that is correct. We have a lot of options in the type of media that we consume. But, people normally tend to resort to their comfort zone. And your comfort zone is probably whatever, media cocoon it is that, that you like. And you perpetually consume, and that becomes, I think, your entire ecosystem. So a lot of, unfortunately, I think, low information voters, this is how I define them in this country, they live in that media echo chamber, where certain signals, messages, symbolisms are constantly being drilled into your psyche, and the end result is even further and more enhanced partisan politics and party polarization. So because you used to have this, this traditional media consumer in this country that was, that was more open-minded, more inclusive in their outlook. But I think by and large, that audience is gone, and a reflection of that is in the you can see in the media landscape that we have in this country right now.
I wanted to add to that also. I was listening to NPR the other day, and RuPaul was on, and he quoted Imelda Marcos, not such a great person to quote, but he said that she said, "Perception is everything, truth is not." And I think that that really entails what cable news is doing today. As long as if the perception of my cable channel, whether it's independent, Republican, Democrat, is to make the other side look bad, I am going to spin it no matter how wrong my side is. I don't want to have, in psychology, they call it cognitive dissonance, that on the one hand, you're feeling like, for example, vaping. On the one hand, everybody is cool if they're vaping and everybody's using the vape, but then you hear the news that it's killing some people, that it's not healthy for you. So now you have to decide, am I gonna continue to vape or not? And so in order to resolve that dissonance, we might say, well, I don't vape that much. Oh, it's the kind of materials that they use. I don't use that. I buy real good stuff. So what happens is that I begin to convince myself, even if I have doubts, I begin to convince myself because that's what my in-group is saying. So I need to belong to my in-group. And before, politics wasn't like that. And the TV news, I remember when I was growing up, you had ABC, NBS, NBC, CBS, Channel 2, the Learning Channel, and then you had Channel 23 in Spanish. And so what would happen is you never knew where the reporter was at. The anchor person would never say, "Oh my God, did you hear that? That's crazy." Today, you know exactly where people stand, and so they're telling you their opinion, and we listen to it and we take it as truth. And so what happens is that they know how to distort our perception, because they're very good at understanding that type of psychology when it comes to marketing. What is it that you want to hear, and how am I going to give it to you? And I'm going to spin it so much that you're going to really believe me. And then you hear it or see it on a Twitter, and then you say it's the truth.
And everything is breaking news on that note, right?
Exactly.
So this, this creating these imagined catastrophes all the time has become a, a permanent feature of that type of, cable news media.
I want to ask a quick question on voting and the importance of voting and the role that identity politics plays in voting and in public policy. Of course, we don't make any endorsements. We're a nonprofit organization. With that said, I will not seek nor accept my party or any party's nomination for President of the United States, the LBJ moment from the 1960s. Some of the audience here are too young to know that moment. But can you tell us a little bit what you believe is the role of identity in voting, and how important is it for everyone to go out to vote, regardless of what party you vote for, regardless of the candidate you vote for, so that you could at least have your voice heard and your identity and your values heard and expressed, especially in a presidential primary election as well?
I think there are two schools of thought on that in political science. Some political scientists believe that identity politics actually incentivizes more people to vote because they feel under persecution and threatened, and because of that, because they want to be recognized, then they become more aggressive in their voting behavior. The alternative view is that identity politics is actually suppressive of voting, because a good chunk of potential voters turn off essentially to this idea of democracy being as inclusive, because they see all types of fragmentation, tribalism, name-calling, cult of personality, loyalism, and other pathologies that we associate with identity politics. And because of that, identity politics tends to suppress voter turnout. So I guess the jury is still out on that question of whether identity politics incentivizes more voting or less. But in terms of voting behavior for those that do vote, I think in an atmosphere of intense identity politics, I would assume that you'll see much less independent voting behavior, that people have already decided what party are they going to be voting for, especially in in our bipolar political structure. So no matter how compelling, how convincing, and how factually accurate either side's arguments are, they're simply not gonna win over more voters, because straw man arguments are more powerful and more impactful than factual arguments. And I think, unfortunately, that's where we are right now. And I'm not very sanguine about the path forward. Sorry for not being the rosiest person here on this panel, but that's that's the way I just see things moving forward.
I would just add to that you're all critical thinkers. Know what the platform is of the person that you're voting for. Don't listen. I know a lot of, in Miami politics, there was somebody by the name of Plummer that he ran for the House of Representatives, but anybody ever saw a picture of him. He was invited to all these panels. He never went. But Plummer, for those of you who may not know, is a very famous political last name in Miami politics. You've had Plummer, the funeral home, which also had a lot of votes for different parties, etc. And then you had Commissioner Plummer. And so what happened was people voted on the name Plummer. The next day, they had a picture of Plummer in the local news, and he was a bus driver, an African-American bus driver, and he laughed all the way to the House of Representatives, because he knew, if I show my picture, they're not going to think I'm related to the famous Plummer, so I'm just not going to show up. And so what happens is, as voters, you have to be educated when it comes to who you're going to vote for. If it's a Latino last name, it doesn't mean that they're on your side. It just means that they have a Latino last name. So you need to also look at, what is my political platform? Whenever you see or hear things, remember, again, perception is everything. I can take out certain things when I'm recording. I can add certain things when I'm recording. And now with the onslaught of all the creative stuff that people can do, make sure you research the facts. And you all know how to think critically and research facts and not Google stuff for information, but to really look at reliable sources. That's the most important thing.
If I could just may add, I think also identity politics creates a lot of single issue voting behavior, that that people vote on just one single item that's higher on their on their agenda. This could be, for example, the Second Amendment. This could be immigration. This could be healthcare, whatever the case might be. I think we have a lot of that, because remember the traditional role of political parties in the United States, and across the board, I would argue, is that they moderate political polarization and party polarization. But that traditional role has been largely eroded, and I would argue maybe it's by and large gone. So we have a cult of personality in both political parties in the country, where the more broad-based party platform doesn't have much appeal with your identitarian, I would argue, voter. They're looking for something with more punch and kick to it, and identity politics gives you that. So it creates a lot of single-issue voters. And if you look at a bunch of recent votes, for example, we had the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, and the Brexit vote, I would argue, was a single-issue anti-immigration vote. And you have some of those examples in this country too, because the promise of democracy has always been, I would argue, something that is not organic and natural to us. Because think about it, democracy asks you to be passionate and temperate at the same time. And these are forces and dispositions that, number one, are not organic to human beings, and number two, they normally operate in opposite directions. So democracy is not easy. We're not naturally and organically hardwired to democracy, to being inclusive, to being, open to dialogue, to living in harmony, to multiculturalism. These things are, don't come naturally to us. I think our natural disposition as human beings is to seek safety. And I think identity politics gives you that safety because it gives you a very solid base for belonging. So you're not confused anymore. You know exactly where you stand. And, like they say, where you stand depends on where you sit. And it gives you that.
I'm going to go now to the audience for questions. And we have a young scholar that we've given the microphone to. And this young scholar is going to ask us a question.
So I was wondering, why do we identify ourselves so much with groups instead of ourselves uniquely? Like, for example, open-minded and words like that instead of being like, I'm a mother, I'm a daughter.
Well, when you're looking at identity per se, it's how you describe yourself. It's how you present yourself. So if I were to say an open-ended question, I am blank, what would you say? You would have to identify yourself as something. When you have children, you want them to call you mama or mother or mommy. You don't want them to call you by your first name. When you are, as a faculty member, I wouldn't want my students to call me Miriam. As a spouse or as any other kind of situation, we always want to belong. That is a human need that we all have, unless we become like mountain men or, the people that live completely isolated from other humans. We have a need to belong. Whether it's belonging to our family, the inner circle, belonging to Miami-Dade College, by belonging in Miami. We have adjectives to describe all areas. It would be wonderful, in my only opinion, not Miami-Dade College, if we were all without borders. I would think that would be awesome. Where it doesn't matter what color, we're all the human race. But unfortunately, you're not looking at generalization. We go into the micro things about situations. So I identify myself as something. I identify myself as belonging to a certain group.
I think your identity gives you, especially your group identity, gives you a sense of anchoring. And I think people feel secure when they have that element of anchoring, especially in times where almost every single group feels like they're being disrespected, misrepresented, and they feel under persecution. And you have it right now, I think, in this country, across the board. Whites, blacks, Latinos, Muslims, Jews, Christians, gays, straights, everyone feels they're under threat and they're being persecuted. So, and that's an excellent question, because in the 1950s and 60s, you had this great society liberal movement in this country, whose initial goal was to advocate and promote a sense of cosmopolitan, universalist, group-blind identity. And their great philosopher, John Rawls, wrote a book in 1971 called A Theory of Justice. And in that book, John Rawls promotes and tries to make the case for the so-called original position case, where everyone lives under behind a so-called veil of ignorance, where you decide on the values of your society regardless of elements of race, religion, language, and so on and so forth. But that cause, that universalist, cosmopolitan, group blind cause, was by and large lost, because you had further fragmentation of, I think, society, and every single societal group asking for recognition. And if you look at the debate over immigration, for example, I think in a European context, you see that that fault line between advocates of assimilation versus advocates of multiculturalism between France and Germany. So in France, the general mood is that we need to assimilate our immigrant population. In Germany, the argument has traditionally been that we need to promote multiculturalism. And I think in this country, we are at a critical juncture on which path we want to take moving forward. Traditionally, this country, I think, has been more about multiculturalism and celebrating and embracing our differences. But we might be moving away from that.
Thank you. We have another young scholar.
Hi. You mentioned before that people nowadays are really polarized. What do you think are the consequences of that? And is it good or a bad thing?
Dr. Abety, would you like to answer first?
I can turn it back to you. I mean, when you're listening to the news today, I mean, even with the coronavirus, it's politicized. What does a virus have to do with how you think politically? And so when you start looking instead of looking at our values, our ideas, our belief systems, what we're doing now is we're getting, objects and things, and we're making it political. So can you imagine, and, I'm going to be an extremist, if you will, but can you imagine you go to the grocery store and it's like, okay, wait a minute, I'm Republican, so do I buy Colgate? No, wait a minute. Colgate is the Democrats' toothpaste. And I mean, it sounds silly, but I never thought that people were going to fight over toilet paper. So when you're looking at politics, the more you polarize, the less you can have a conversation. In the past, with my friends and my colleagues, we would always be able to sit and discuss our differences. And we would explain why I think my political party is the one that you should vote for, and then you would say the reasons why you think your party is the one to vote for, and we would agree to disagree. Today, families, they don't even gather anymore. They have this thing, no politics. I have my ex-sister-in-law who says, I will block you from the social chat if you talk politics. That's how much it's injuring. It's no longer at a national level. It's at a personal level where you have siblings that don't talk to each other. And you would think because of politics, I mean, to me, that's irrational. But I think that that's what polarization does. It makes us very irrational. It makes us feel threatened. And when an animal is threatened, what is it that they do? They lash out to defend themselves. And that's at the rate I think that we have gotten now to an almost animalistic, very primitive thinking, me against you. And if I were to sit down and talk to you, I would probably find 90% more similarities than differences. But we don't look at that anymore.
Thank you, Dr. Abety. Dr. Homayounvash?
For me, the biggest drawback, and I think the heftiest cost of polarization is that it's very corrosive of our institutions. And people come and go, politicians come and go, presidents come and go, senators and lawmakers come and go, but institutions stay. And that's why I think this atmosphere of hyper-partisanship and identity politics is just so detrimental to the depth, to credibility and legitimacy of our institutions. And I think a very good case in point, as Dr. Abety mentioned, is the coronavirus. Now there's, trust deficit between your average, American, depending on, on their party affiliation, and the message they're getting about, a purely medical, you would think, issue from, from the government. And that's where you see this the real cost of erosion of trust in our institutions and their credibility and legitimacy. And obviously it creates blind spots, tunnel vision. And those are not good things, because they foreclose the I would say the realm for constructive dialogue and to advancing the ball on different issues.
We have a question from this young scholar over here.
Okay, well, you just mentioned the issues that come with polarization and maybe some of the bad things that could happen because of this. So I would like to ask, how can we, if we can, ever separate ourselves from this polarization and the negative outcomes that come with identity politics and the idea of us versus them. And if ever, how could we lift this veil of ignorance that exists in separating us from them?
Actually, veil of ignorance, according to John Rawls, is a good thing. It's something to be celebrated because it, you know, it just, I guess, it moves, you know, a lot of those blinders that I mentioned create, you know, blind spots and tunnel vision. So it's something to be celebrated, at least according to John Rawls. But how you overcome this? I think number one is, you know, travel. You know, this is a big world. Travel and keep an open mind and embrace differences and celebrate them, and try to have, you know, a circle of friends from different you know, backgrounds, political backgrounds, racial backgrounds, ideological backgrounds, religious backgrounds, geographic backgrounds, you know, wealth backgrounds. So so uniformity in circle of friends, I think, is becoming increasingly more common in this country. Because our segregation, like I said, that geographic segregation, I don't want to call it segregation, but geographic maybe divide between urban and rural/suburban, I think feeds into racial segregation and religious segregation. And these three forces, like I mentioned, they're working in tandem and in synergy, and they're reinforcing each other. So in order to defeat it, I think you need to really transcend those, you know, those fault lines. Is it easy? Of course not. It's going to take, you know, a leap of faith, a leap of imagination, and it's not easy, especially when you're being constantly bombarded by this highly partisan media that we have in this country.
We have a lot of study abroad opportunities here, even though there are travel restrictions at the moment in place. But once travel restrictions have been lifted, please look into the great travel abroad and study abroad opportunities we have here at Miami-Dade College, especially in the Department of Social Sciences that I chair.
And also take some of those courses that we're going to be offering, as Dr. Tapia mentioned. I think those are some courses that maybe we won't have traditionally exposure to, and they will really, I think, broaden your horizon.
And if you can't travel at the moment because of travel restrictions, then we could travel within the classroom in those comparative politics courses. Dr. Abety?
Yeah, I wanted to add, you all are the future of tomorrow, right? You are the leaders. Some of you will be the followers, but be involved, I would say, is like the most important thing. And listen to language. I think that how we communicate with each other says volumes of how we believe and how we're going to behave. So if you look at people that attack, let's say a candidate, when you're looking at politics, well, I'm not going to vote for so-and-so because he's an idiot. By you saying an idiot, what exactly do you mean by idiot? I mean, give me proof, give me facts, tell me where they stand. It doesn't matter if they're too short, too tall, too ugly, too pretty. None of that has anything to do with your future. In this country, we really have to think who we're going to vote for. And you cannot lead and follow, or just not, you can't do anything. You cannot just sit and wait and let life happen. And right now, I think we're living in a lot of dichotomies. Either you're good or you're bad, you're a communist or you're not. And you're not looking at the whole picture. What does it mean to be a communist? What is it to be socialist? What is a capitalist? I mean, find out, be informed. It's the most important thing. And reach outside of your community. On this campus, we're 85, 90% Latino. Go out into other communities, find out what their struggles have been in their countries. Talk to your parents, your grandparents, find out in their country what was the voting policy and how do they see it here in the United States. And I'd say anybody that comes from any authoritarian country, the right to vote is such a privilege. Don't waste it.
Thank you, Dr. Abety. We have a question here from the young scholar.
Good morning. I would like to ask, going back to the identity questions, is that do you think it's healthy that an individual has an identity in politics at an early age, or it's better if they start developing an identity when they become adults?
So when it comes to identity socialization, the process in which values are instilled into the individual, at what point do we see the most amount of identity development? And is it better, does identity happen earlier or later in political development?
That's actually an excellent question, and one over which I think there has been change. Because you could argue that the first initial context of socialization into a certain identity is your family. But I think the families are becoming increasingly less capable of delivering on that. So now you have other sources that are more intrusive and maybe more determining of your identity. It could be your religious affiliation, the church or the mosque or the synagogue that you go to, if you do, and then obviously the media is a big chunk of that. So I think these at least three forces that come to my mind initially, they're working in ways that are new. For example, social media is a big part of it right now, which was essentially non-existent, a decade or so ago. So I think initially it's still probably family, but increasingly so, I would argue, is the media, the social media, traditional media, the news media that you consume, and also I think the religious affiliation and maybe where you live. I think geography could also be quite important in that regard.
I think I would only add to that, and I agree, 100%, is also looking at the aspect of what is your citizenship? Thinking about citizenship, civics, what do civilized people do at an early age? If you teach your children, whenever you're having an argument, you don't necessarily, call them names because they're wrong, you're wrong, and I'm right. It doesn't matter. It's just, this is how I see it. This is how you see it. And I think that the more they learn how to argue, and it is okay to debate, just like it's okay to be angry, it's the behavior that you have after you're angry that counts. If you don't agree with a group of people because, they don't have the same color of eyes that you do, you're not going to go and attack them and do something to them. And unfortunately, with the polarization we have today, it's like feel threatened because they have a different color of eyes and they're out to get you. And so it's teaching our kids, when you start having your children, that we have to learn to be a community. We're human race before we're anything else. And something like the coronavirus, I think, is demonstrating that. But the thing is that we have to learn that as human beings, we all bleed red. And everything else is, like they say in Spanish, me can be.
We have another question here from
Good morning.
one of
My
our scholars.
question is, do you think we have discrimination on the presidential elections based on the candidate's identity, and how does it affect the elections?
So we'll start with Dr. Homayounvash.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Like, based on the gender, age, the race, and how does it affect?
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of so-called glass ceilings, obviously, based on those items. I guess based on age, maybe to a lesser extent based on age, but maybe more so based on on gender, based on race, based on your sexual identity, based on your gender identity, maybe even based on your economic class, I would argue, and even more I would say mundane stuff like maybe your religion or lack thereof, for example. I think those are all still an integral part of that presidential elections process, and I think we've moved on in the right direction on some of those items, but we have a very long way to go.
I would just add that it doesn't matter how you describe the candidates, whether it's a man, a woman, someone who's gay, someone who's an economist. That really isn't important when it comes to who you're going to vote for. It's looking at their values, their belief systems, their track records, because that there can more than likely there's going to, for sure, there's going to be a senior citizen as president. So does that mean that the young people, aren't going to be represented? Of course not. So it doesn't really matter who they, how they describe themselves. What does matter is what are they standing for? What is their platform? What is it that they're promising you that they're going to do? And is it true that they're going to do what they say that they do? All the other descriptors are just that, like you were saying. Why identify whether it's a man, a woman, old, not old, whatever it is. It's look at the platform.
Perfect. Thank you. One of our students or young scholars over here has a question. If you could please go ahead and
Hi, good
ask.
morning. So I wanted to ask why you think race, gender, or religion is so mentioned in politics when it's supposed to be relevant to the process.
So why does it take such a role within our political process when
Polarization is what
we should consider these other options that Dr. Abety mentioned?
Because again, I think it just creates this, you could call maybe false, or I don't know, maybe real comfort zone. And comfort zones are not easy to get out of. So unlearning intolerance is extremely difficult because again, we're not hardwired to tolerance and to inclusivity. So any point of differentiation that you find could become an anchor for safety and security. Some psychologists call it ontological security, secure in who you are, and race, religion, and what was it? And gender, they could become a good pillar or anchor or bedrock of that ontological security. So are you willing to let go of that? Probably not. I mean, your ordinary person would probably not be as as broad-minded and as willing to challenge their comfort zone. And like they say, the comfort zone that you don't challenge later on becomes your limits of of consciousness, of thinking. And like Dr. Abety said, they could really foreclose the door for critical thinking.
Dr. Abety?
I think it was well stated what he said.
Well stated.
I agree.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank the audience for coming out. Again, my name is Richard Tapia. I am the moderator of Identity Politics in 2020 presidential elections. I'm also the chairperson of the social sciences here at the Eduardo J. Padron Center. And I'd like to thank Dr. Homayounvash, who is the director of the Jaffer Institute and professor of political science here at the Padron campus. He teaches comparative Middle Eastern and North African governments. Sections are available in the summer, and he will be teaching Islam in America in the fall here at the Padron campus, as well as Islam in the Modern World in the spring semester as well. Dr. Miriam Abety is a professor of psychology here at the Padron campus. And again, she teaches human services, psychology, abnormal psychology. Also is going to be teaching domestic abuse and family violence in the fall semester, and introduction to psychology, human growth and development, and a variety of other courses. If you're interested in these topics, please feel free to come afterwards, speak with the panelists. It was extremely successful. I'd like to thank everybody involved, in particular Miami-Dade College TV. I also want to thank the Jaffer Institute and the Eduardo J. Padron campus for all of their collaboration, the professors that were involved. We had Dr. Abety, Dr. Homayounvash. We had also Dr. Aragon, who basically came out with all of his classes. So I was very pleased with the outcome. I'd like to thank everybody involved in putting this event together.
I thought it was excellent. I got really good feedback, and we got really good questions, very well formulated and thought out, and they were quite engaged and interactive, and I thought it was very constructive.
The most important thing that I would like for them is to realize that they are supposed to be informed consumers in this country, which means that they should also go out, do their responsibility. Voltaire had that saying, lead, follow, or get out of the way, and that's pretty much what I hope that they take from this, that they understand that they are our vision for tomorrow, and it's their decisions too that are going to impact their generations in the future, like ours did for them.
The Jaffer Institute, which is our Institute for Interfaith Dialogue and Education, we'll be doing a series of events talking about these types of topics in the upcoming semesters. Please feel free. And once again, please join me in thanking our panelists and the audience for their attendance. Thank you. Great job.
Thank you. And please vote if you can vote.
Please vote. Thank you.
We voted.